I want to now introduce you to our keynote speaker. Carole Starr came very highly recommended to us. When we were talking with folks we know about having this gathering, a couple people said, oh, you really need to have a conversation with Carole and see if she's available. So I did that, and I'm delighted to say Carole was available to come and join us today. And there is a little bit of information in your packet about Carole, and she's also going to tell you a little bit about her life and what she's up to right now. But Carole is one of the co-founders and co-facilitators of Brain Injury Voices, which you'll hear a lot about this morning. And I'll also encourage you to look up their website. There's a link to it in your packet. But they're really doing a whole lot in Maine to bring together brain injury survivors and to spread the good word about what people are doing. Carole is someone who is very interested in bringing her story out to other folks, and is really starting to have a very busy presentation schedule. So we're so glad to be able to have you today. So I'm going to hand this over to Carole, and we'll get our day started. Thanks.
Well, I am so delighted to be here this morning at this Living Our Story conference. I really love that telling stories is the theme for today, because every single one of us in this room, we all have compelling stories, whether we were survivors or caregivers. Today is really about sharing those stories and listening to the stories of others. Since the beginning of human history, people have been telling stories, first around fires, around dinner tables, around conference tables. Stories are what help us to make sense of the world, to see our place in it. Telling our brain injury stories can be a step towards reaching self-acceptance and understanding. So this morning, I'm going to be sharing my brain injury story, my personal story of finding happiness again. There's an old John Lennon song that says, "Life happens when you're busy making other plans." Isn't that one the truth? 16 years ago, the way I thought my life story was going to unfold was I was going to continue to build my teaching career, I was going to get married, have a family. I knew there was going to be ups and downs and bends in the road. Of course, that everybody has those. But there was no room in my story for a Mercury Sable going 50 miles an hour to broadside me on the driver's side when I was 32 years old, leaving me with a lifelong brain injury. But that is what happened. The story that I'm going to tell you this morning is not one of making a miraculous recovery and triumphing over brain injury through grit and determination. To tell you the truth, I find listening to quote, full recovery stories kind of difficult, because I'll tell you, I have tons of grit, determination. I've worked really hard, and I still have a brain injury. I will always have a brain injury. So instead, my story is a quieter one of how to come to terms with and how to accept the life-changing challenges that we all know come with brain injury, and to still be happy, even with the disability. My hope is that even though this is my story, that you'll find strategies within it that are useful for yourself or your family member. So please take whatever is useful to you, just leave the rest behind. I'm going to begin with two quotes. I really like quotes a lot. The first is by Helen Keller, who, being left blind and deaf from scarlet fever, she knew a heck of a lot about living with a disability. She said, "When one door of happiness closes, another opens. But often we look so long at the closed door that we do not see the one which has been opened before us." The second quote is by Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain during World War II. He knew quite a bit about fighting battles that at first seemed hopeless. He said, "Never, never, never give up." So I took those two quotes and I combined them to create the title for this speech, "Never Give Up on Happiness." As all of us in this room know, brain injury, it tends to do quite the number on happiness. It can change or destroy so many of life's fulfilling aspects, like the ability to hold a job, to socialize with family and friends, to enjoy hobbies, to take care of oneself. Brain injury, it doesn't just close a door of happiness, it slams it shut, then for good measure burns it. At least that's how it felt to me, particularly in those early years. To find happiness again, I had to tear myself away from the wreckage of the old door of my life, find the new door, and figure out how to unlock it. For a really long time after my injury, I wanted desperately for somebody to give me a plan, to say, if you see these doctors, if you see these therapists, do these exercises, then you will make a full recovery. It seemed like the treatments that I found were just by chance, and nobody could guarantee me that full recovery that I so desperately wanted. I wonder if some of you have felt that way about wanting a plan and not being able to find one. Eventually, I had to accept that all of us have to navigate our own unique, long, bumpy road of twists and turns and dead ends, hills and valleys, of good days and bad. You just have to start somewhere and never stop looking for help. That's why Winston Churchill's advice of never, never, never give up is so very important for all of us as survivors of brain injury. There's an old expression that I'm really fond of, and I think it applies pretty well to brain injury. It's, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. How do you find happiness after brain injury? One step at a time. One story at a time. Looking back now, I have the benefit of nearly 16 years of experience as a brain injury survivor. And I can identify those steps, those stories, the key actions and moments that helped me along my own bumpy road back to happiness. I just use the word key on purpose because I'm going to continue with Helen Keller's metaphor of the door. The keys to finding and unlocking my own door of happiness have included regaining competence, purpose, independence, competence, and purpose, as well as there are a few big moments in there, kind of mental breakthroughs, and I'll get to those a little bit later on. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell you a little bit about my life before the accident, the brain injury, and then what it was like, particularly during those early years. So that will give you some context as I share my own journey back to being happy again. In my pre-accident life, two of the things that made me happiest were teaching and music. I think that all of us have core identities, core things of just who we are. I've always been a teacher at my core. Teaching has been part of who I am, starting in elementary school when I would tutor my classmates. It seemed like no matter where I was, I always found some way to teach. After I got my master's degree in adult education, I was primarily self-employed as a corporate trainer. I go into different businesses and teach soft skill type courses to workers. I used to say I'd teach anything but math. I could use a math class. I really loved learning new materials, figuring out creative ways to communicate it. I like to feel good at what I do, and teaching made me feel confident and competent in who I was. Outside of work, I was really involved in classical music. I played the violin for 23 years, since I was 9 years old. I was in a community orchestra. I also sang in a chorus. I absolutely loved being a musician. I loved rehearsing, performing, being surrounded by sound all around me. Music, it gave me the opportunity to be part of something bigger than myself. There are a lot of people who love loud rock music. I loved loud classical music. Yeah, I was kind of a nerd, I admit it. I had planned to be an amateur musician for the rest of my life. On July 6th, 1999, I was on my way from one teaching job to another when I was broadsided on the driver's side by somebody going about 50 miles an hour. The last thing that I remember is a really loud sound of metal on metal. The airbags went off, windows broken, the car spun 180 degrees across the median, eventually stopping on the other side. But I don't have any memory of any of those things. I only know they happened because I read the accident report when I saw the photos later on. I was taken by ambulance to the emergency room, and they sent me home with just a diagnosis of whiplash. My head did hurt, but somehow I didn't connect that if my head hurt, maybe I hit it. They asked me, "Did you hit your head?" And I said no, because I don't have no memory of hitting my head. They didn't ask me, "Does your head hurt?" I was also asked, "Do you remember everything?" I was very confident. I answered yes. I had no idea that I actually had really big gaps in my memory that I was completely unaware of. Apparently, I was saying over and over again, "It's all my fault, it's all my fault," which I don't have any memory of at all. It took about 6 weeks for my brain injury to be diagnosed, and then it was nearly a year before I received formal rehab treatment for it. And believe me, that year was the worst year of my life. When I tried to go back to my normal life after the accident, it became apparent that something was very wrong. I was just exhausted all the time and my head hurt. It would feel like someone was literally squeezing my brain. I was trying to teach for 2 hours. 2 hours of teaching would put me on my couch for literally 2 days at a time. I couldn't do anything else. I couldn't remember my students' names. Every time they walked in the door, I'd say, "Are you new?" I did eventually learn not to ask that question. I couldn't remember what we discussed. I would lose track of what we were doing. I couldn't follow my own lesson plan. It just seemed like everybody was talking so fast, and I couldn't focus or follow the conversation. That crushing mental fatigue was just unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I'm sure many of you in this room can relate to that. That fatigue was brought on by the most simple of activities. My morning shower would exhaust me. I'd have to take a nap right after. For about the first 2 years after my injury, I had really bad hair days. I also tried going back to music. Now, I had played in orchestras since I was a kid, so it was always like a second home, but not anymore. The second I walked in, the sound was so loud, it was just everywhere in my head. I started to cry instantly. I couldn't tune it out. And I got so confused that I didn't know where to sit in an orchestra I'd played in for 10 years. I opened my violin case, a string was broken. I didn't know how to change it, something I'd been doing literally for decades. I couldn't even remember how to get home, so a friend had to drive me. I spent days on my couch after that, just a few minutes of music. It just seemed like the ultimate cruel joke to afflict a musician with an intolerance to sound. I didn't know it, but my brain injury had left me with hyperacusis, an extreme sound sensitivity. I hear everything as much louder than it really is. For example, for a long time, whenever a plane would go overhead, even if I was inside, I would literally duck because it sounded so loud to me, like it was just coming right at me. If there was a sudden loud sound like an alarm, I would scream, oftentimes fall because of sound. Like I said, I have earplugs in. I also have headphones with me just in case there's a loud noise. It just felt like my entire life, including all the things that had made me happy, was just completely collapsing around me. I was also struggling with basic life activities. At the grocery store, I would stand in the produce section for a very long periods of time with an apple in each hand. Couldn't figure out which one to buy. I have a master's degree, and I was bamboozled, absolutely bamboozled by apples. I once spent half an hour or so in the bread aisle because they were out of the brand that I buy, and I had no idea what to do. I had to call my mother, and she had to tell me what to do so I could figure out how to get out of the store and get home. The food I did manage to buy would generally go bad because I couldn't figure out what to do with it. For some strange reason, to this day I don't know why, I got fixated on cottage cheese, and that was pretty much what I would eat for most meals. Still, when I get tired, that's where I head towards, is my cottage cheese. I'd always loved to read, but I stopped reading books, magazines, the paper, because it was so hard to focus and follow the text. Family gatherings, which I'd always really enjoyed, just suddenly became unbearable. I had a hard time following the conversation, especially if more than one person was talking, or there was lots of background noise. I couldn't remember what people told me, although I did try to hide that from my family. My speaking was slow and halted. I'd lose my words. Oftentimes I just didn't say anything. I felt so alone, like I was a stranger among the people who knew me best. I'd often call family or friends and say, "I don't know what to do." Or, I think even more difficult for them, I'd have a good literally half hour, and I'd call and say, "I'm ready to go back to work," and then not understand why they disagreed so strongly. I felt like I was a burden to my family and friends, like I was a failure as an adult. My emotions were all over the place. I cried a lot over the strangest of things. I sobbed over sappy television commercials, whenever plans would change, when a bumblebee got in my house. You would not think that the Rose Bowl parade could be tear-worthy television, but it was for me. I seriously wondered if I was going crazy. I kept thinking that if I just tried harder, if I pushed harder, that I could make this brain injury go away. Have any of you had thoughts like that? If I could just try harder, I could make it go away. Yes, I see some nods out there. I think it's a common thought that we have. It doesn't work, does it?
No, go away.
Yes.
With it.
Yeah, I wish it would work.
Yeah. sign us up for this trip.
I'd always been somebody that believed that anything is possible if you just work hard enough. For the first time in my life, that just wasn't true anymore. The harder I pushed, the worse everything got. I felt like I was just failing. While all that turmoil was going on inside my head, people kept telling me, "Carole, you look great. You're doing fine." But I wasn't. There were times when I almost wished for a cane or a cast, a something that would let people know that I had an injury, that I was struggling, that I needed help. When I tried to explain what was going on in my head, people would often say things to me like, "Oh, that happens to me too," and just dismiss what I was going through as run-of-the-mill, ordinary stuff that everybody goes through, which of course we all know it's not. How many of you have heard statements like, "You look great"? Yes, again, I see more nods. Early on, I just didn't have a way to respond to statements like that. I didn't have the words to describe the invisible injury of brain injury. It took me years to learn how to describe my injury and to not be hurt by comments like, "You look great," and "Oh, that happens to me too." Until that level of wisdom came, I was just traumatized by people's comments. I blamed myself for not trying hard enough, for being weak, for being lazy. None of those judgments were true. I ended up having to stop both teaching as well as music. My life was reduced to medical appointments and literally 4 naps a day. The grief over all the losses was just overwhelming. I really thought that grief was going to break me. We've all experienced the grief over losing a loved one. My mother died 5 years ago, and I can honestly say that the grief I felt over brain injury was worse than the grief I felt over her death. After the brain injury, there were times, more than I like to admit, when I thought seriously about ending my life. I'm going to read you a poem that I wrote during that time. It's called Phoenix. At the end of my street, on the edge of the marsh, stands a tree. She does more than stand. She commands your attention. Full of her fall flash. No ordinary red, orange, and yellow for her. She sparkles with crimson, umber, magenta, and ochre plumage, a rising phoenix with outstretched wings, confident and bold. But her time is brief. Perhaps her color is burned too brightly. Her plumage dulls, darkens, and drops, exposing frail gray bones, pale and naked. Who is she now? The tree will have her time again. Will I? Several years later, I actually answered that last question in another poem, and I will share that towards the end of my remarks. So to recap, here are the major brain injury symptoms that I was, and in varying degrees still am, dealing with. Extreme mental fatigue that requires daily nap times, difficulties with executive function, planning, organizing, making decisions, reduced ability to pay attention and concentrate and remember, sound, light, and balance sensitivities, and emotional issues, including feelings of loss and sadness. So now I'm going to move into the meat of this talk, the process of refinding happiness. I promise it gets cheerier now. As I mentioned earlier, my 3 keys to happiness have been regaining independence, competence, and purpose. I think it's interesting, as I went through those, I really thought about growing up and realized that those 3 keys kind of are what we all go through when we grow up. As we mature, we move from dependence on adults to independence. We strive to discover our competencies, the things that we're good at, and also to answer those eternal questions of, why am I here? What is my purpose on the planet? Understanding my brain injury journey is kind of like growing up all over again, is part of the reason why I call July 6, 1999 my second birthday. And now I celebrate it as a second birthday. I got a new life on that day, so I celebrate it by doing new things. It is not a day of sadness anymore. It is a day of celebration for me, because it is.
I do the same thing.
Good for you. Now, as I approach my sweet 16 in a couple of weeks, I'm very glad that this second adolescence has not come with pimples.
Or drama.
For the first several years after my brain injury, it really did feel like my life was over. I just couldn't imagine how I was going to be happy and productive again. So my journey back begins with my first key, regaining independence. For me, regaining independence has centered on being able to take care of myself at home and function out in the world. It was my occupational therapist who helped me to develop strategies and routines to regain my independence. We had to start small, find success, and build on that. Brain injury or not, that's actually a pretty good plan for most any task. Start small, find success, and build on it. Trouble was I really did not want to start small. I was kind of stubborn. There might be some people who say I still am stubborn. I wanted to start on the big things. I wanted to start on teaching, on music. I thought that if only I could get back to those big things, then everything would be okay, and I could be happy again. But every time I tried, and there were so many attempts, I failed. And failing over and over again just gouged huge chunks out of my self-esteem and confidence, and it made me hate myself even more. I had to learn how to start where I was at that moment, think smaller, and change my focus to relearning the basic tasks of everyday life. Things like shopping, meal planning, cooking, bill paying, running errands, taking care of my house, visiting with family and friends. Until we get the basics, the small picture stuff mastered, nothing else is going to work. I needed strategies for all of those things. I needed step-by-step instructions for how to do those tasks that used to be just easy, run-of-the-mill, ordinary. I had so many therapists who tell me, Carole, you need to use strategies. I so rebelled against using strategies. I did not want to. Whenever I thought about using strategies, it brought to mind a 4-letter word beginning with F. It is not the swear word you might be thinking of right now. It's fear. I was scared that if I used strategies to get things done, then my brain wasn't healing. It was like I was giving up and letting the injury win. With a lot of help, what I realized was that success with strategies feels a heck of a lot better than failure without them. I realized that I have to do what works for my brain right now, not what used to work, not what I wished would work. That has so not been an easy lesson for me, but it is crucial to refinding happiness. When we focus on what we can't do, we spiral down into grief and self-pity, which is a very lonely and soul-sucking kind of place. And yes, as you all know, having a brain injury sucks. But focusing on what we can do, using strategies, will lift us up and make brain injury suck just a little bit less. My OT and I created something that we called my Circle of Recovery. It was actually kind of a set of circles. It looked like a bullseye, and each ring of the bullseye had activities listed in it. It was how I would gauge my progress. I needed something really simple and very concrete so I could judge kind of how I was doing. The middle of the bullseye was home. I had to concentrate first on learning strategies so I could function successfully at home before I could work on being out in the world. I can't stress enough how important success is. It's important for all of us to be able to find ways to experience success. Successes don't have to be big, just meaningful. Finally experiencing success, even for me when success was just cooking dinner, was such a big step towards me regaining some of my self-esteem and confidence. Experiencing success can help us to stay positive and motivate us to want to use more strategies, to have more success. Gradually over time, I worked on being out in the world more, first with family and friends, then more on my own. I'm now up to the point where on my own, I can be out of the house on any given day about 4 to 5 hours, several days a week for that, other days maybe just a couple of hours. I can't attach any deadlines to this progress, not that I have not tried. In the early days after my injury, I'd say, okay, 3 months, I am going to be back to work. Then it was 6 months, then it was 9 months, on and on and on. Every single deadline that I set just passed by, I could not meet it. And that just made me feel more like a failure and more unhappy. As we all know, the timelines after brain injury are so much longer than we think they're going to be. I've learned that deadlines are for people who have more control over what they can and can't do on any given day. My brain runs the show, not me, so there's really no point in setting deadlines that I can't possibly meet. I'm still using that Circle of Recovery, that little bullseye tool today. It helps me gauge when I'm doing too much. I know that when tasks I've mastered at home things like meal planning, cooking, when those things start to fall apart and get difficult again, what that means is I'm out in the world too much. I am doing too many things that I have to take a giant step backwards to where I can find success again. That's always my benchmark. Where can I find success? And when I start to fail, then I have to go back. As a result of using a lot of strategies, most of the time now, I can organize my day, I can shop for groceries and other necessities, I can cook healthy meals, take care of my home. The earplugs, I have to also have special glasses. Those help me function out in the world. It is, sometimes for a limited amount of time. I had to realize and accept that independence after brain injury is quite different than it was before. Independence doesn't necessarily mean doing everything all by myself anymore. Sometimes independence means knowing when should I ask for help, when should I involve my family and friends. Because as much as I hate to admit it, for a long time, my team, family, friends, medical professionals, they were way better than I was at assessing my capabilities. I would overestimate time and time again what I could do. And that is why literally every person I know has had to rescue me and drive me home from something at some point. But by learning to listen to their advice, my own awareness and judgment has improved. And so I need rescuing a lot less now. It has meant that life has lost a lot of its spontaneity for me. Everything I do takes a lot of careful planning. But that is how success happens. I'm working at being a traveling brain injury speaker. And I know that I have mental endurance issues, so I map out my time. And I know that actually after I do this speech, I'm going to go take a nap for an hour. That's just what I have to do. I've now come to the point where I know myself and my injury well enough that I can manage and trust my own judgment at least most of the time. Gradually, as I continued to feel more independent, I stopped hating myself. I didn't yet like myself again. I still felt useless most of the time, but I didn't feel quite so helpless. So independence alone, that wasn't enough to make me happy. I wasn't satisfied with just being able to cook and do meals and all those sorts of things. I needed more than that. I needed competence. I needed to feel good at something. I think brain injury or not, that's a basic life thing. We all need to feel good at something. For much of my life, my sense of self was very much based on how good at something I was. I'm one of those type A perfectionist high achievers. Because my sense of self was so closely tied to my ability to achieve, when that changed, I just totally lost myself and felt just completely adrift. I met with a lot of different psychologists and counselors, and they all told me that people with personality types like mine, high achievers, often had a particularly difficult time adapting to and adjusting to the changes brought on by brain injury. They were all correct about that one. But honestly, at this point, having come through that process, the reward of happiness is made all that much sweeter because the journey was so difficult. And so now I like to tell people, well, I'm not type A anymore. Now I'm type A minus. So to regain competence, I had to find new activities that I could enjoy and feel successful at. I was really surprised after the brain injury to discover a new desire, a desire to use my hands to create, which was something that I had never done before, something I had no interest in before my injury. To this day, I am so proud that I listened to that little voice inside that said, make something. I think that we all have that little voice inside us that whispers to us, that can guide us towards happiness if we can just pause to listen to it. Listening to that quiet voice that said, make something, was the very first time that I turned away from beating unsuccessfully at the old door of my life and toward opening the new one. Because using my hands was so very different, I had no comparison to how the old Carole would have done this. So therefore, it didn't activate any grief over what I'd lost. I think that's a really important part of happiness, is concentrating on doable activities that are new. So then you can't go down that grief road of, well, I used to be able to do this. I started out very, very simply with a basic paint by number. This is it right here. Because I had such difficulties with concentration and attention and fatigue, when I started this, I could only work at this 15 minutes at a time. and then I'd literally have to take a nap for about an hour or so. I felt a little silly at first, being a grown woman working at this, but to be honest, I loved working on this. I liked seeing the colors come together. It was so satisfying to be able to start and finish something, because so many things I started that I just hadn't been able to do. I'd had to let go because I'd failed at. I felt relaxed as I worked on this. Successfully finishing this paint by number really increased my feelings of competence, and that gave me motivation. Said, I want to try other crafts. So I started making jewelry. Actually, made the jewelry that I'm wearing today. I've done cross-stitching and knitting and all kinds of different things. Through doing a lot of different crafts, that really helped me to regain some of my abilities to concentrate and to pay attention. It gave me a sense of mastery, a sense of accomplishment. The more I made crafts, the more people said, oh, could you make something for me? And I realized I could make gifts for people, that I didn't have to be useless, that I could give back to others. I participated in an art show at the rehab hospital where I received my outpatient treatment, and there people actually bought my jewelry, which was just a remarkable feeling that people wanted to buy something that I had made. As part of my volunteering at that hospital, I taught other brain injury survivors how to make jewelry. That gave me a way back into teaching, which of course is just one of my core identities, and that added more competence. 12 years ago, I participated in a workshop at the Maine Brain Injury Conference on creativity. And there I had my first opportunity to speak briefly in front of a group again. I was so nervous. My right leg shook the entire time that I talked. But honestly, it felt like I was coming home. And I just knew I need to do more of this. So in those 12 years since then, I've gone from being part of panel discussions, to giving short talks, to organizing workshops, to running conferences, to delivering keynote speeches. My dream is to be a national brain injury speaker. So far, I've done events in Maine, New Hampshire, I can add to the list now, Massachusetts, and Washington, D.C. 5 years ago, I co-founded Brain Injury Voices, which is a volunteer group of survivors in Maine. Our mission is 3 words: educate, advocate, and support. What we do is we educate medical professionals about brain injury from the survivor point of view. We advocate for how important it is for survivors to get rehabilitation services. And we peer mentor other survivors. We are brain injury survivors who have combined our individual strengths to pay it forward and make a difference as a group. Last year, we actually received a prestigious National Volunteer Award from the American Hospital Association, one of just 4 in the country. We traveled to Washington, D.C. for that ceremony. The fact that Brain Injury Voices exists and is as successful as it is proof that when survivors get together, when we share our stories, wonderful things, great things can happen. I have a short video about Brain Injury Voices that I will show at the end of this talk. I'm so proud to call myself a teacher again. Now I know that most likely I will never hold a full-time job, but I have found a way to have a successful volunteer career that works with what I can do right now. I can trace the competence that I gained from this very paint by number to the competence I feel at this exact moment, standing here in front of all of you. I had no idea 14 years ago of the direction that this paint by number would take me in. That's the beautiful thing about competence. When you listen to that little voice inside and do what you're good at right now, you just never know the amazing direction that it can take you over time. Never give up on having dreams. Yes, brain injury means that our dreams often do have to be revised, but working towards something, eating that elephant one bite at a time, can move you in the direction of happiness. For me, a big part of regaining competence has involved documenting it. I keep a portfolio of my post-brain injury accomplishments, both large and small, anything that I'm proud of that represents progress. It's called After the Crash, and I brought it with me. It's gotten so big that my other name for it is the Beast. You can lift weights with this thing. This, the size of this, started out the size of this. This started out originally as just a little folder in my desk called Stuff I'm Proud of. As I did things I was proud of, I just put it in here. When I was in a patient in outpatient therapy, one of my rehab therapists helped me to take the stuff from this folder and put it and categorize it into a binder like this. What it has in here is pictures of crafts that I've made, poems, presentations, programs from events I've attended, the meal plan that my occupational therapist and I developed so I don't have to eat cottage cheese for dinner anymore. When I feel down, this portfolio reminds me of just how far I've come. Activities that are in the back that were once so supremely difficult for me are now no big deal. Looking at its size and contents reminds me that I have a heck of a lot now to be proud of. When I'm sad and all I can see is the things that I can't do, this reminds me and lifts me back up. I don't even have to look inside it anymore. I just look at the size of it and I feel lifted. So one thing I encourage all of you to think about is starting your own stuff I'm proud of folder. As I continued to make the crafts, especially the jewelry, a lot of people told me, Carole, you should make that into a business. But I love these sorts of things as hobbies only. I knew that in addition to finding competence, it was really important for me to find purpose. In hindsight, as I think about my life before brain injury, it was full of activity. I was very busy, but there really wasn't a lot of purpose to it. I was basically running on a treadmill that just kept going faster and faster, but it really wasn't taking me anywhere. I was teaching, but I didn't feel like I really liked my subject matter that much. I didn't know where I was going. I think some sort of crash was probably inevitable. I never dreamed it would be quite that literal. To me, purpose is a kind of inner wisdom, a deep knowing of why am I here on this planet? What do I have to offer the world? How do I make meaning out of what's happened to me? I think that those kinds of deep questions are not just nice things to answer after brain injury. I think they're crucial to acceptance and moving forward. Happiness can flow from having a sense of meaning and purpose in life. It's not just me saying that. Actually, research backs me up on that one. Way back in 1946, there's an Austrian physician named Viktor Frankl. He wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. It was based on his experiences in a Nazi concentration camp. And what Frankl observed were that his fellow prisoners, those of them who were able to keep hold of some sense of meaning and purpose in their lives, even amongst the most horrible of conditions, they were the ones who survived longer. They were the ones who emerged less scarred when the ordeal was over. Frankl wrote that life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by lack of meaning and purpose. In other words, if we can tap into the big picture and find some sense of purpose in brain injury, then it is indeed possible to bear the unbearable. I recently read some research that said that is proving now that having a purpose in life has more than just like psychological kind of benefits. It actually can affect our nervous systems, our cardiovascular and immune systems in really very positive ways. As awful as having a brain injury has been for me, one silver lining is that it sharply focused my sense of purpose. I know very clearly now that I want to use my life and my experiences to help brain injury survivors, to help the professionals who help them, to build awareness. My limitations do restrict how much I can do, but I've discovered that having a sense of purpose is more about quality than quantity, about choosing to make meaning out of suffering. None of us chose to have brain injuries, but we can choose how we look at it and what we make out of it. For me, having a sense of purpose not only helped me find happiness, it also helped save my life. I mentioned earlier I've had suicidal thoughts in the past. There are a number of reasons why I never acted on them. Love and support of family and friends, counseling, medication, and purpose. I knew that I was meant to learn something from brain injury, to do something with it. And if I checked out, I was going to miss that opportunity. I had to make a choice about how I was going to view my brain injury. I could look at it as just a random event whose only purpose was to ruin my entire life. That's not going to get me anywhere. Instead, I chose to view brain injury as a teacher. I'm sure many of you experienced in school. Oftentimes our toughest teachers are the ones that we learn the most from. Brain injury has definitely been my toughest teacher ever. The more life-changing the event, the more powerful the emotion, the more opportunity that it provides us to learn. By learning from our experiences, especially the challenging ones like brain injury, we can create meaning and purpose and turn emotions like anger, sadness, and fear into acceptance, self-understanding, purpose, and joy. Now, the realities of brain injury certainly have not made learning easy. It's been excruciatingly slow going, full of trial and error, 2 steps forward, 1 3/4 steps back. There's also been times when it's just felt like I wasn't moving at all. But I have learned. I've learned important, meaningful, hard-won lessons, lessons that maybe I wouldn't have learned in life otherwise. So I want to share with you just some of what brain injury has taught me. As you listen to these lessons, think about whether some of these apply to your own experiences. Brain injury, like life, is a team sport. I can't do it alone. I listen to my family, friends, and medical team and the advice they give me. It's not a sign of weakness to ask for their help. Figuring out when I need help and asking for it are signs of courage and insight. I focus on what I need to do to be successful in the present. Sometimes that means working hard, and sometimes that means taking a nap. I understand what it is to struggle. I'm a better person for it. My empathy and perception skills are stronger as a result of all of my struggles. I might get scared, have weak moments, but my determination, motivation, and absolute refusal to give up will always win out. I'm not just a cracked version of my old self. I'm a new, whole person who is different than I used to be, but no less valuable. There are no small accomplishments. There was a time for me when successfully cooking supper was as big an achievement as standing here in front of you is now. Successes build on one another. So as you can probably tell, I believe very strongly in the value of reflection and learning. Thinking, writing, talking about my brain injury story have helped me to make sense of all that's happened to me. The better I understand my own story, the better I can use that story to help others. So now what I'd like to do is actually to give all of you a chance to do a little reflecting on your own stories. Since this is a conference on storytelling, it seems kind of appropriate. Because when you understand what you've learned from brain injury, it is a step towards finding meaning and purpose, and that can lead you to happiness. So what I have in your packets, it's on a yellow piece of paper, is an interactive exercise. I'll let you find the piece of paper before I continue. Yes. It's a two-sided, one is kind of the main points from my speech, the other one is the exercise. The exercise is three questions, or one question really divided into 3 parts. It's what has brain injury taught you about yourself, about others, other survivors, family, friends, medical professionals, about life in general. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to talk at your tables, talk with each other, share some of your stories about around these questions. Now, I know there's not enough time to really fully answer these questions, so just to talk about what your first reactions to them. There are no right or wrong answers. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give you about 5 minutes to talk at your tables about these questions. So go ahead and have some discussions. So I asked you to do that exercise. I had actually several reasons for doing that. 1, I know that this is a long time to sit and just listen to one person talk. 2, I thought that the exercise could be helpful. I wanted to give you an opportunity to tell some of your story to each other. I encourage you to continue to think about those questions. I know that I have been pondering them for nearly 16 years now, and I continue to find learning in them. And reason number 3 for doing that exercise goes back to one of the lessons I've learned from brain injury. I focus on what I can do in the present. This is a long time for me to be standing up here talking to you. It is the longest keynote that I've done so far. Part of the reality of my present is that talking makes me tired. So what I did was I designed that exercise to give my brain a few minutes of rest. So thank you all for being part of my strategy. I'm ready to move forward now. So early on after my injury, I decided that I needed a lighthearted way to describe my brain injury, something that would make me and others laugh. Often it seems like there's me, and then there's the brain injury, kind of like there are 2 people living inside my head. So I said, well, why not give that a name? So I call my brain injury Brain Hilda. Ah, Brain Hilda. She is quite the diva. She is a tyrant. When Brain Hilda decides it's time for me to rest, there is no arguing with her. No matter what I've planned to do, want to do, need to do, no matter where I am, who I'm with, or how much fun I'm having, if I don't honor her and lie down to rest, she will force me down. Basically, Brain Hilda gives me two choices, lie down or fall down. Believe me, I've done both. I tell you all that as mentioning another key part of finding happiness, and that's humor. To continue with my door and key metaphor, humor is kind of like the WD-40, the grease that makes everything move just a little bit more smoothly. Humor, of course, doesn't change a brain injury. It doesn't change a bad situation, but it does somehow make it a little bit more bearable. I spoke about choosing to learn from brain injury a few minutes ago. Just like choosing to learn, choosing to laugh is also a choice. When Brain Hilda rears her ugly head and confines me to my couch to rest, believe me, my first instinct is to cry, and I have cried buckets of tears over all this over the last 16 years. But with time, I've learned to see the humor. For example, I told my doctor a while back that, I have had so much beauty sleep at this point that one of these days I just know I'm going to wake up as a supermodel. Okay, so I've regained independence, competence, and purpose. I've even been able to laugh at my situation. I should be happy, right? Well, I wasn't. The continuing symptoms of my brain injury would just push me into sadness and despair. Then one day, more than 10 years ago now, I was meeting with my counselor, and she asked me this question. She said, "Is it possible for you to accept that you're not going to make a full recovery? Can you still be happy?" That question hit me like a ton of bricks. I instantly started crying, not just a couple of tears, but the loud, hysterical kind of sobbing, the kind of embarrassing kind of sobbing. The fact that my old life really was over just seared through me in that moment in a way that it never had before. In that one moment, what I realized was that I was judging every bit of improvement, every bit of my life really, against the standard of the old Carole. My happiness was conditional. It was dependent on how close to normal I was functioning. In other words, I was still desperately trying to unlock my old door of happiness. I had thought that regaining independence, competence, and purpose would unlock the door to my old life. But they didn't, because in fact they are the keys to my new door of happiness. After that conversation with my counselor, I was more able to stop judging myself against the old Carole and focus more on accepting and learning to appreciate the new Carole. In coming to terms with brain injury or any life challenge, there comes a time when we have to stop looking back at the life that was, the life that's over, and focus on the life that we have now, the life of the present. Until that flip happens, we tend to stay stuck and unhappy because we're always looking backwards. For me, that process, it took roughly the first 5 years of my brain injury. An interesting side note is actually my counselor, she heard me give this speech several years ago, and she said, Carole, I was asking you that question for like 6 months, and you never responded to it until that one time. So you just never know when the right question at the right time is going to make an impact. More reason to never, never, never give up. How many of you have had the frustrating experience of working really hard at something, yet the harder you try, the worse it gets? That's pretty much all a brain injury, isn't it? Sometimes the way forward when something is challenging isn't to do more, to try harder. Rather, it's to let go, to give it a break. Notice I didn't say give up, but rather let go, because they are different. Understanding that was the next big lesson about happiness that I learned about 8 years ago now. At that time, despite the fact that I liked myself again, and I mostly accepted the brain injury, I still struggled with how unpredictable my symptoms were. I just never knew when a sudden noise or movement or too much talking or too much thinking was just suddenly going to overwhelm me. Despite very careful plans, things would often go badly. I have overloaded and been driven home from so many places unexpectedly that I think my car has spent more nights away from home than I have. I've also napped in so many odd locations now that I tell people I sleep around. Just recently, I came up with a new slogan for myself. Those of you who are Trekkies might like this one. It is, to boldly nap where no one has napped before. Clearly, I find it funny now, but for a long time, I didn't. and I kept trying to find the right strategy, the right treatment that would stop me from overloading. Then about 8 years ago, I went through a period where I had trouble sleeping, which of course just left me even more tired. As that was going on, it just hit me. My life is always going to be like this. There's always going to be some brain injury symptom or other to deal with, no matter what I do. No matter how hard I work, I simply can't change the fact that I have a brain injury. I'd had that thought before. It had always kind of depressed me. But on that day, I found it freeing. On that day, I finally truly let go. I gave in. I surrendered. I stopped fighting what I had no control over. I realized that I didn't need to triumph over brain injury in order to be happy. I could accept both the symptoms as well as their unpredictability. It was a feeling of victory, not defeat. I know it doesn't make logical sense, but sometimes letting go, surrendering, really is what can move us forward after brain injury. Now, surrendering and letting go, they have not miraculously cured my brain injury. I still tire easily. I overload. Sometimes I need rescuing. I still deal with sound, visual, and balance sensitivities. I still spend more time resting on my couch than I'd like, and sometimes I feel sad about what I can't do. My brain injury symptoms are annoying, time-consuming, and limiting. Like I said earlier, kind of sucks. Letting go means I accept all of those things, and I focus on what I can do right now. Letting go means that despite everything, I choose to be happy anyway. Letting go doesn't mean I've given up trying to improve. I still see about half a dozen different doctors and therapists, and I continue to make progress, slowly and in small steps, even now, nearly 16 years post-injury. I refuse to give up. Letting go means that I trust that where I am right now, even when that place is my couch, is where I'm supposed to be. I can be happy in this moment now, even as I strive to continue to make progress. So if you're struggling really hard with something, you've done everything you can, think about letting go and see if something good can happen. That letting go breakthrough 8 years ago opened wide my new door of happiness. Since that time, I've been consistently happier than I was even before the brain injury. As I've talked about these breakthroughs I've had over the years, they might sound almost magical. Maybe some of you are out there thinking, how did she do that? Or I could never do that. For many years, I sat in the audience at brain injury conferences, and I listened to speakers talk about letting go and moving on, and I thought, there's no way on this green earth that I could ever do that. But I did, and yes, it is possible. In preparing this speech and thinking more deeply about the acceptance process and letting go breakthroughs that I described, they didn't seem as much like magic and more like very hard-won endpoints in a really long process. Those breakthroughs that I just described to you were the culmination of years of storytelling, of talking and writing, thinking and listening, crying and laughing, learning and using strategies, falling down and getting back up. Every single step that I took, even the ones that felt like I was going backwards, were steps in the direction of my new door of happiness. Many years ago, I was watching Andy Rooney on the television show 60 Minutes, and he was talking about lessons that he's learned over the years. He said, time doesn't heal all wounds, love does. And that brings me to one final key, one that I haven't mentioned yet. I think because it's really been part of all of the others. I guess you could call it the master key. It's support. And it comes from so many places, from family, from friends, support groups, doctors, therapists. I know for a fact that I could not have gotten this far, physically, mentally, or emotionally, without the dedication, patience, and optimism of my team. I want to specifically thank my friends, Ross and Rory from Brain Injury Voices, who came here with me. I couldn't get myself to Concord, so they are the reason that I'm able to be here today, so thank you very much. And on behalf of all of the survivors in the room, I want to thank the caregivers, the family members who are here. Caregivers, you're the unsung heroes of brain injury, because your lives have all been changed too. So thank you for all that you do to support us as survivors. Brain injury has taken me on a road I never could have foreseen and to lows I did not know existed. But in addition to happiness, I've also found courage and insight that I didn't know I had. Early on in the speech, I read you my poem, Phoenix, which ended with the question, "The tree will have her time again, will I?" I always knew that I was eventually going to write a response to that. It took many years, but I did eventually write a response. That poem is called Phoenix Revisited. At the end of my street, on the edge of the marsh, stands that same tree. The haunting, hoping desire, "The tree will have her time again, will I?" finally answered with a quiet confidence, "No." For that is the wrong question. I'm no longer that tree. I'm a new being on a new journey, spinning, sailing, falling, flailing, writhing, wailing, landing, in my own soft space, safe, to root and to rise, to live this new time. My wish is for each of you to find your personal doors of happiness, because from where I stand right now at my new door of happiness, I'm very glad that I never gave up. Thank you.